Hey everybody, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show here on Reason and Theology, joined by Professor Michael Dunnigan, coming back to the show, returning guest. Great to have you back on. We're going over his book, Religious Liberty and the Hermeneutic of Continuity, Conservation and Development of Doctrine at Vatican II. Link to it in the show notes. Highly recommend that you get it. Professor, welcome back to the show. It's an honor to have you. How are you?
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm fine, and it's great to be with you again.
You know, as soon as I got my copy of this, I was excited because first of all, it's relevant to my dissertation. So I already knew, okay, I need to dive into this. And number two, I saw you addressed Exsurge Domine as we were discussing backstage, and my eyes lit up because I said, yes, we need this to be addressed more often. And it's nice to have a professor to back me up on this issue. So I'm not just a YouTuber theologian doing it, but a professor's backing me up. So we'll perhaps talk about that here in a little bit. But yeah, let's maybe just kind of begin with some general things here. In the title, obviously, it's Religious Liberty and in the Hermeneutic of Continuity. Perhaps for people who are not familiar with that phrase, hermeneutic of continuity, could you introduce us to that concept?
Sure. I think that's a good place to start. Well, hermeneutic, of course, is the 50-cent word, the kind of, and it just means, though, an interpretive key, or I like to think of it as an interpretive lens. So something that you can, so it could be either good or bad in a sense. If you're using a hermeneutic that's fair and that includes some principle of fairness to the people you're studying, that should be fine. Some folks may have heard of sort of a hermeneutic of suspicion. Sometimes the founding fathers are addressed this way, where
Yeah.
someone will say, look, they weren't really on addressing principle as much as they were feathering their own nests, protecting their own financial interests. And again, fine to study that, but um, others that have studied the other side of it sometimes say, well, really, the opponents to the founding fathers had pretty much the same financial interests as they did themselves. So that might be a hermeneutic of suspicion.
Mm.
These two, this phrase hermeneutic of continuity, though, comes from Pope Benedict
Mhm.
XVI,
Mhm.
certainly a fair-minded scholar in his own right. Particularly the year he was elected Pope, he was elected in April, and then this phrase comes from an address that he gave to the Roman Curia right before Christmas. And in it, he recounts several events of the previous year, of the year about to end, especially
Mhm.
the death of John Paul II, his own election, World Youth Day, but also the 40th anniversary of the close of Vatican II. And he asks, what has been the result of Vatican II? Was it well received? And what still remains to be done? And then he answers his own questions, or he starts to answer his own questions by contrasting two very different and opposed hermeneutics. One is the hermeneutic of discontinuity and rupture, and the other is the one we're talking about, the hermeneutic of reform or renewal in continuity. The hermeneutic of rupture, he says, this is one that he says risks a split between the preconciliar church and the
Mhm.
postconciliar church,
Yeah.
and it asserts that the texts do not represent the true spirit of the council. The Some critics, especially people very involved in the drafting of some of the texts, thought that the final versions of those texts represented too many compromises, often
Mhm.
compromises urged by Paul VI, and that the true spirit of the council resides in those things that veer towards newness.
Mhm.
And what we should follow then is not the texts themselves, but the so-called true spirit of the council. Benedict, after describing the hermeneutic of rupture, said that this is somewhat like delegates to a constitutional convention just starting over and starting their own constitution. He says this is something we can't really do in the church. We don't have a mandate for that. Yes, we can have dynamism in a council, but we must have fidelity as well. We have to have, as Paul says, I passed on what I received. I passed on to you what I received. So he contrasts this hermeneutic of discontinuity and rupture with the hermeneutic of reform and continuity. And he quotes John the 23rd in particular, who said that at the very beginning of the council, that the council was going to, quote, transmit the doctrine pure and integral without any attenuation or distortion. We may find new ways of presenting it, but we have to pass on the doctrine pure and integral. So Benedict kind of then proceeds to talk about kind of three, he calls them circles of questions that modernity raises for the church around the time of Vatican II. One is the relationship between faith and modern science. And the other two are ones that might be close to our discussion today. The relationship between the church and the state, and the relationship between Christianity and other religions. What Benedict will say then, kind of sort of concluding, but really just concluding kind of his beginning of this discussion, is that where the interpretation of Vatican II proceeds according to a right hermeneutic, the results bear much fruit.
Well, did he change his position by the time he's here in 2005 as as the Pope speaking to the cardinals there? It seems like when he was a young Ratzinger as a parade at Vatican II, writing some of his experiences about it after the Second Vatican Council and his theological highlights of Vatican II, seems like he just kind of threw the document under the bus and just wants to say, yeah, it looks like there's a contradiction here. But I feel like he walked that back in 2005. Am I reading that correctly?
I think you're quite correct. He did, and one of the scholars on religious liberty, an Australian priest named Brian Harrison, he deals with this, and so Father Ratzinger would have been in his mid to late 30s during the time of the council, and he was an expert or peritus, as you say, to one of the German bishops. And at that time, I haven't seen the actual statement myself. I'd like to see it, but you've seen, okay. You'll have to send it to me. That he thought this represented a change or a fundamental change to some degree. And now this was in the 1980s, when Father Harrison was doing his licentiate thesis, he wrote to either Ratzinger himself or else to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, where Ratzinger was prefect at the time, and just kind of very respectfully asked, does the prefect still hold this position? And got back a short but very polite letter saying, no, he no longer does.
Yeah,
he
that's
kind
right.
of accepts.
That's right.
And then he would, of course, go on to be very involved in these very tumultuous debates in the 1980s, some of which involved Dignitatis Humanae. One, the debate with Lefebvre's followers, and also the debate with Father Curran, both of whom cited Dignitatis Humanae as supposedly supporting them. One thing I'll say for the young Ratzinger, though, this was one, Father Harrison, I forget when his dissertation was published, but it was in the late 80s. And one of the things that really made it possible was that in the, I think it was the late 70s, all of the acts of the council were finally published. And they're huge. If you see them in a library, they're huge books, and there's just a ton of them. I'm sure you've worked with them in your own research. And, but that wasn't available before. Before that, you're taking the word of people who were there or reporters or something, or people just didn't know. They didn't have the statements of the Vatican II fathers on different topics. So that might be something we have to take into account in the young Ratzinger's opinion, and why he, like, unfortunately, with Harrison's work, Harrison was very good in languages as well as and so he was able to deal quite well with the
Sure.
different thing. But anyway, yeah, no, I think that's all a
Yeah.
very interesting kind of historical and cultural point there.
And I bring it up because people will still raise it as if that's all Ratzinger has said on the subject, and just kind of, mentioning it here from memory. I don't have it in front of me, but what he says in his highlights of Vatican II is something to the effect that, yeah, there is that clause in the document that talks about how the traditional teaching remains intact, but then everything else after that in the document completely undermines it. That's basically what he was saying, and that's not a direct quote, obviously, but that's the effect of what he was saying. And
That's
yeah,
interesting. That's interesting.
I don't agree with that, and I also think that it's clear he did walk that back. So
Interesting.
yeah,
That's interesting.
right. So, anyways, let's talk about the relationship between church and state throughout history. You engage some of those views. Can you maybe walk us through this? Obviously, things haven't always been just uniform. There's different perspectives out there. Can you maybe walk us through that?
Sure. As I think observers would know, we've seen many different arrangements. I won't. I'll try not to belabor it.
Mhm.
Give me the give me one of these if I
No, you're
go
fine. You're fine.
if I
I'm
go
fine
too
on
far.
time. So I'm, however long or short you want to go.
But as we know, in the early centuries, our huge problem was persecution, and so the church's preoccupation then, not surprisingly, is seeking freedom, and probably Tertullian would be the person to read, especially here. And then
Mm,
with Constantine in the early fourth century, then the church is granted freedom, as others are as well. It's a sort of a general extension of liberty. And then late in the fourth century, the Emperor Theodosius actually adopts Christianity as the religion of the empire.
mhm.
And from then on, we have uh, sometimes very interesting, sometimes very close, sometimes less so, um, s- relationships between the Pope and the Emperor. Of course, the Roman Empire is about to fall, so the
Yeah.
Western Empire and the shift of the focus is going to shift, if you're interested politically, more to
Mhm.
the east, with the Eastern Empire. What we're going to say, kind of until we get to the Holy Roman emperors, and then we've got, I think we sort of resume this closeness with the emperors and the popes, but not
Mhm.
always. We still have
Right.
sometimes friction as well, and in the we're facing these huge challenges in the
Mhm.
Middle Ages up to the beginning of the modern period. The threat of Islam, the invasions from the Vikings in the north, several waves of the Black Plague, um, some heresies like Catharism or Albigensianism, Gallicanism, sort of this distinctively kind of French heresy that, or I don't know if it's quite a heresy. It's sort of a political, kind of a political approach to striking out a more independent national, almost like thinking of the French church as a national church, something like the Orthodox
Mhm.
churches look at it. But then that would also spread to other countries later, and of course the Reformation in the early 16th, or starting in the early 16th century, and then the wars of religion, and closer to our own time, kind of an age of absolutism, the absolute monarchs in especially Europe, I'm thinking of, and also the formation of the modern nation state. Now, during this time, so we're thinking especially of, I suppose, the 17th century, even into the 19th century, you've got countries and kings that are officially Catholic or officially Protestant. So you do have a type of union. However, you also there's a certain decadence as well. And a historian to read would be Philip Hughes. He's very disenamored or unenamored, I don't know what the correct word is, with the monarchs of the absolutist period, particularly with the suppression of the Jesuits. It says the suppression of the Jesuits just shows you how little real authentic faith was really left in the supposedly Christian monarchs. And I think closer to our own time, we get into the Enlightenment and the Age of Revolution in the late 18th century, and then going well into the 19th century. Our time being especially characterized by, well, first, especially at the beginning of the Age of Revolution, anti-clericalism, anti-Catholicism, really just the theft of a lot of church property. And then later on, we've got or even around this time, the rise of constitutional government, the Industrial Revolution, modern totalitarianism, and a threat that we have now, radical individualism. So it's hard to generalize with all this, so much history, but there is an important thread. I wouldn't say it runs throughout all of church history, but it's something. It's an important trend, and it's there, at least distinctively in several places. I think you could really say it's a permanent part of our tradition, and it's what I'd call, or what often is called, Gelasian dualism for Pope Gelasius, sometimes Christian dualism. And the key text that it's based on is so in a sense, you could say this goes back to the gospel, is render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. That text, we look at that text now and often think of it as establishing the two realms, the political, or the temporal, and the religious. It wasn't immediately seen that way. It was immediately seen as a way to vindicate the church's liberty and the liberty of individual believers. However, when Pope Gelasius himself, this is late 5th century, so in the 490s, he writes this famous letter to the emperor, and he says, "Oh, august emperor, there are two powers, and just as you are supreme in matters of the state, so is the church's power supreme in the sacraments and affairs of the church." So really a landmark, really world historic document that he writes. Very short pontificate, but incredibly consequential. And you'll see this idea of the Pope. So here we really get this idea of the Pope and the Emperor as key actors, and through time that will have slightly different permutations, but you can really see a continuity there. So sometimes we'll be talking about the Pope and the Emperor, sometimes about the temporal power and the spiritual power, sometimes about the two orders. Maybe that when we're talking about the High Middle Ages, the two orders within Christian society. And then closer to our own time, we're usually going to talk about this in terms of church and state. And the principles sort of behind Gelasian dualism are, one, you can kind of hear this in Gelasius's own letter, the distinction between the two realms. These two realms, the spiritual and the temporal, they are distinct, and each is autonomous, and each is supreme within its own realm. Now, might sound like separation of church and state to those of us in the U.S., and there are similarities, but I think for our discussion, what we might want to focus on is the important differences, because they're by no means identical. One of the reasons they're not identical, when we think of separation of church and state, I think we immediately think of Thomas Jefferson and the wall of separation between church and state, that we want an absolute separation, that we want no interaction, or as little interaction as possible. That's at least I wouldn't say that's necessarily the American idea, but it's a very influential interpretation. It's by no means the only one, but a very influential interpretation. Definitely not the church's idea, though. The church's idea is, yes, there's a distinction, but there should be collaboration and cooperation between the two realms. They
Mhm.
both are serving the same subjects. The citizens of the temporal realm are the subjects of the ecclesiastical realm. This also, it's so funny, if you're talking about realism, you normally would think civil rulers would be more realistic than the church. Honestly, though, this Gelasian dualism is a much more realistic approach than strict absolute church-state separation, because strict separationism really neglects the fact that, whether we want to or not, the church and the government, or now in our day and age, when we say church and state, we're kind of thinking of religion generally and the temporal power generally, they have to interact at some points. There's just no, you either give an exemption, a tax exemption to religious bodies, or you don't. There's no way to sort of be complete, just to be 100% neutral, because you're deciding something, you're making some kind of decision. And the same thing with recognizing conscientious objection, other things that could have, how church property is held in a certain country. So I think something that some of the very almost absolute separationists, and kind of the one that's of most interest to us in this debate, is John Courtney Murray. I think in some ways he may have been more strictly separationist than Jefferson was, but I think a difficulty in some of his thought, as important as he was, a difficulty is that he did not really take account of the necessity of the two powers dealing with each other, like at least occasionally.
I'm curious, since you bring up Pope Gelasius, I mean, right after him, basically like 40, 50 years later, we start to see the Byzantine papacy, right? Where you have emperors basically, if I'm not mistaken, in some instances, determining who is going to be the Pope. Do you think that would have been an abuse of what the Pope was putting forward, or do you actually think that was maybe consistent with his view?
Yeah, good question, but like a lot of good questions, a difficult one as well.
Yeah.
And so thank you. But it's so thanks for the frying pan you
Yeah.
put me into. But um, that is that. I think that really is. I think that really is problematic, and that's a struggle I think the church had so many times. And I think one of the things that uh, there's so much to be said for the Christian East, and for the
Mhm.
compliments, and the liturgy and the traditions and so forth, as far as resisting kingly or imperial influence. Do not think they did a great job usually. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. I think you see more resistance in the West, not in this period in the West, because now in the West, now in the East, we're talking about, as you say, we're talking about very powerful emperors, Justin and Justinian,
Mhm.
almost potentially at least making a try at recovering the Western Empire as well. So very important figures here. And then as we go on, whereas in the West we've really got a very weak, we've got very weak feudal governments. We almost don't have state governments or empires. We're really almost divided into swaths of land. But yeah, I think that is a real difficulty that we have to struggle with, because we've got it works well to say, yeah, let the two powers cooperate, but when you really get down to concrete issues, that proves to be difficult
Right.
sometimes. And in the West, a lot of I'm not saying that it was always done well in the West, but you do have some real heroic resistance. I'm not saying you don't have it in the East. I'm probably just not as
Yeah.
well versed on it. But you think of Becket and Henry II in
Mhm.
England. You think of the popes in standing up to Napoleon. You think of a number of others, but these things where you really see, I think, more of a pushback to secular leaders, where I think that has been more difficult in the East.
Yeah. Though, like you said, sometimes they offer pushback. I think of the Second Council of Lyons, right? I mean, they offered
Right,
some
true,
pushback on the
yes,
emperor's
indeed,
decision there.
indeed.
So,
Good,
among
that's right.
other ones,
That's
maybe Florence too. So yeah, but let's talk about religious liberty specifically. Let's talk about the preconciliar popes on religious liberty. Could you maybe explain how they tended to define it? What was the scope of the right to religious liberty? And then once we address that, then we're in a better position to address Vatican II and what it means by the term.
Oh, good, good. So the period we mostly would be focusing on with the preconciliar popes is essentially the French Revolution and its aftermath, at least in the first instance. So beginning in 1789 and going forward, um, about as far forward as you want to go, but at least 50, 60 years, and arguably 110, 120 years, and in some ways arguably all the way up to the council. But the popes we're going to really be considered with mostly are the ones in the last 3/4 of the 19th century: Gregory the 16th, Pius the Ninth, and Leo the 13th. Um, so, but even before that, we have a very important statement by an earlier pope, and this statement doesn't always get a lot of attention here, but this French scholar, Father Basile Valois, points this out, and it's a document by Pope Pius VI, and it's in I think it's in 1790. And what he's doing is, no, I'm sorry, 1791. He's responding to the civil constitution on the clergy in France, and this just essentially took over the French church. It was the government taking over the French church, entirely reorganizing it, providing for the election of bishops, excluding the Holy See from governance, and providing for governance by the secular authorities. And so he responds to this. And one of the reasons we don't discuss or you don't see as much discussion of this in the religious liberty debate is this document I want to talk about. It's called Quod Aliquantum. It was not a universal document. Most of the documents we'll deal with are encyclicals, so they're addressed to usually the bishops of the whole world. This document, as important as it is, it's not even addressed to all the French bishops. There were a number of French bishops in the National Assembly, and it's addressed to those ones in particular that are in the National Assembly.
Does this mean it's not authentic magisterium then?
No, I think it is. If you found a reason to, sort of need to limit it, or you found something problematic in it, that would be something to say, well, this isn't, this isn't addressed to the whole church. I think we have the benefit of looking back. Maybe he didn't we realize how consequential. We're only 2 years out, and so maybe he would have said, "Oh, it's like the horror movie where we know we know who's behind the door, but Pius VI may not know who's behind the door or what he's holding." So that might be, or maybe he was just a bit modest and was addressing this, or hoping maybe in a sense in a subsidiarity type way to address it with a lesser measure, something like that. But a really, really important document. And this monk I mentioned, Basile Valois, says that this document is key to everything that came after the popes that we're used to speaking about: Gregory the 16th, Pius the Ninth, and Leo the 13th. And I think he makes a good case there. So what Pius VI talks about here are 2 or 3 articles of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. This is a document that's sometimes considered sort of parallel to the U.S. Declaration of Independence. But really, I think the two revolutions stand for quite different ideas. But the articles in that declaration that Pius is addressing are Articles 10, 11, and 1. And 10 is on freedom of opinion and freedom of religion, and 11 is on freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And Article 1, the first article, is on natural rights. And what Pius is really concerned about is that these rights that are being recognized. Now, if we read this document, it's going to look not that different from the First Amendment. But as Pius is reading it, what he's concerned about is that these rights are being described in an almost unlimited way. That there are almost no, maybe if I'm expressing my rights in a way that denies you yours, maybe that's where mine would stop. But that's about it. And not just a right to believe what I want to believe, to say what I want to say, but even to publish and disseminate my ideas
in a Catholic state.
Right. So we're still talking about, now we're in this kind of weird, that's an interesting question. So we've got this would be 1790, 1791. So we're at that, I'm trying to think when Louis XVI actually was dispatched. Was it 1793?
Oh yeah, I'd have to go back and look. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, so maybe formally, but that's certainly culturally, sure. The eldest daughter of the church and so forth. Absolutely. Right. And I believe this was before the actual Reign of Terror. It was early enough there. So then you really do have this the substitution with a revolutionary government. But he's concerned especially that these rights are being framed as virtually unlimited, and also that they're being framed as natural rights. And I think looking back, some of the concerns, especially from Vatican II, when we look back, they seem to be, when they're stated, when they say anyone can embrace any religion that he wishes, the right is described in a way to attach to the content of other religions, and the church is going to have a difficulty there, saying this is, if there are religions that lack some elements of truth, then there should not, in the strict sense, be a right, or a positive right. Now we're going to find at Vatican II that Vatican II finds a way to affirm religious liberty, but without affirming the content of every religion in the world. I guess that was a spoiler alert. Maybe I should have.
No, that's fine.
More cagey about that. But so he's very concerned about these things, calling these rights natural rights, and just their very unlimited nature. In fact, some people would read these rights and say, "Boy, are they actually saying that someone has a religious right before God, even?" And I believe that's a question that Valloway raises, because they're kind of painted in very broad terms. The popes that follow will also they'll often, when they kind of criticize the way the right, will usually be described as, sometimes it'll be described as liberty of conscience, and sometimes as liberty of worship. And this idea of, boy, these are just unlimited rights that are being asserted, that's going to be something that the following popes are often going to focus on. But starting with Gregory the 16th, he becomes very concerned about the problem of indifferentism. He says that liberty, he writes about liberty of conscience in particular, doesn't mention specifically liberty of worship, but it's a pretty close concept. But he says the real root of liberty of conscience is indifferentism, the idea that all religions are the same, or it really does not matter which religion you profess. And that is something that's going to alarm the popes very much. One final concern that they're going to have, and this is really all of them in the I think even Pius VI, but certainly the 19th century popes, they're almost always going to focus not just on possible harm to individuals, but harm to society and harm to the church, but also harm to civil society. So that's also going to be a problem with looking at some of these rights and saying these are such kind of unbridled rights, and that they could very well harm individuals, but also the church and civil society as a whole.
I have a quick question. I see Valloway is writing in French on the question of Pius VI and Pius VII. Are there any English translations, not just of Valloway, but more importantly, Pius VI and the relevant document we're discussing here?
That is a good question, and I think that only recently, I think there is one. There's a kind of a small volume. Boy, I don't think I have it here with me, but it's either about Pius VII or his immediate successor, or Pius VII and Pius VI. I think it's both of them, and it's got at least the key documents in English and some commentary. So I'll try to find that title and send it to you.
I see you have excerpts from an English translation by Harrison for quote aliquantum by
Yeah,
Pius
now
VI.
he does his own translations, so
Right.
that's you'll only have what appears in his book. There might be a book cited though.
Jeffrey Langan. Here it is. You say that it appears that the first full English translation of this document appeared in 2016. Jeffrey Langan, The French Revolution Confronts Pius VI. So is that
Okay,
kind of
that's what
that's
I'm
the one?
thinking.
Okay,
That's
good,
what I'm
good, good.
thinking. Did you say it was
All right.
2016? Okay,
Yeah, you
I
have
thought it was a little bit later. Okay.
yeah, you have 2016 in here. But
Okay.
this is good to know because I want to go and look at this. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's surprising even in as I say, I think Harrison deals with Pius VI, and Valloway definitely does, but you often see even some really excellent treatments of religious liberty that don't get to Pius VI. So I'm very grateful to Valloway for pointing that out.
Yeah, so you're saying this document is really key to understanding everything in the preconciliar popes after him, Gregory the 16th and so on.
Yes, yes, I agree. That's really Valloway's position, but I agree with it entirely. Yes.
So could we maybe I don't know if you want to transition to this yet, so feel free to maybe not move to it yet if you're not ready to pivot to it, but could we maybe compare then the preconciliar popes on religious liberty to Vatican II? Does it, when it speaks of religious liberty, is it referring to the same thing, or is there some kind of nuance and distinction at play?
Good. No, I think I think that is a good thing to switch to.
Mhm.
So we have kind of a slightly different term that the Vatican II will use. They'll say religious liberty. I wouldn't make too much of that because um, the term that you'll have in the 19th century, liberty of worship, is quite close. They're not identical, but quite close. And really, I think our main concern is not just with the phrase and whether it's the same phrase or a similar phrase, but really with the
Mhm.
content.
Right.
What's the real content of these rights? So, as we said, the 19th century popes are very concerned about this. Um, the what's interesting, I was about to say this unlimited right. What's funny about the 19th century popes is they sometimes describe the right as two rights or as multiple rights, and they have different they sort of switch. Some do it one way and some do it another. Some will say this right is just really dangerous, or others will say these rights are dangerous.
Mhm.
As far as I can tell, they're really talking about the same thing, and they have just about exactly the same concerns, but they discuss them differently because they're looking at the ones who discuss it in as just one right. will look at it as, well, there's this individual component to the right. Here's the danger to the individual for embracing this right. But also because there's also a right, so we're talking about Articles 10 and 11 of the French Declaration, there's also a right to propagate these ideas. It has a important social ramifications. So there's a danger to the individual and to society. And that for that same reason, other popes will talk about two rights, that this is this kind of right, probably the Article 10 right, the right to opinion and religion in the French Declaration. And they'll think of Article 11, the right to press and publication and speech, as a different right. But the popes, despite talking in that way that is a little bit confusing, because sometimes it sounds like one right, sometimes it sounds like two rights, their concerns are virtually identical. They're concerned about the individuals, but just as concerned about the social impacts. So with regard to the unlimited nature of the right, or virtually unlimited nature of the right, probably not absolutely unlimited, that Pius VI identifies, that the other popes talk about, Vatican II is quite different, because it repeats over and over again that the right that it recognizes is limited. It's a right within due limits. Kind of the key are, you've studied it, so you've seen it, and it's the within due limits isn't always repeated, because it's kind of taken as understood in some places, but it's repeated many times. And so kind of the key articles are 2 and 3, and 2 says that this idea of religious freedom that Vatican II is recognizing, it means that all men are to be immune from coercion in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs within due limits.
Right.
It concludes with within due limits. I've omitted some of the text there to streamline it, but whoever wants to read it can look at the actual document and look at Article 3 as well. You want to read those two together, within due limits. And that's, I don't think within due limits is repeated in Article 3, but it's repeated many times. So this is very important. And the document is going to give us an idea in a number of places what some of those limitations are. So that's one thing very clear, that we're recognizing, Vatican II is recognizing a limited right. But also what the kind of the nature of the right that it's recognizing. It's not, well, this is a very difficult thing to sort of achieve at Vatican II, is to recognize a universal right to liberty that did not necessarily affirm the content of the various different religions. Because the idea, the traditional understanding is, for something truly to be a right, it has to be a right to something that's true or good. You can't have a right to something that's bad, or that's false, or even really partly that's deficient in truth or deficient in goodness in some way. So the way that this was, and this is somewhat controversial, but the way that the council achieved this, and I have to give credit to John Courtney Murray here. He wasn't the only one. I'm critical of Murray in a number of areas, but he really helped with a real advancement here, as he did in a number of areas, but in framing the right, not as a positive right, not as the right to, I have the right to embrace this particular cult or something, but as an immunity, as not a positive right to believe anything that I might want to believe, but rather an immunity in religious acts within due limits, a right to freedom from interference generally in the sphere of religious action. And in this way, by describing the right as an immunity, it avoids the problem of recognizing a right to something that's not entirely true. And so the right's not attaching to the content of the various religions, but kind of to the sphere of religious activity generally, or we might even say to the human action of seeking truth, searching for truth, fulfilling his obligation to his creator in searching for truth, and in embracing the truth once found.
Does the distinction between preconciliar popes, perhaps, at least in some cases, addressing the context of a Catholic state versus Vatican II seemingly addressing a secular state. Does that distinction also factor in here in this discussion on religious liberty and showing that there isn't a direct contradiction?
It does. It does. It's funny that talking about this document gives rise to the kind of the whole huge question of what the correct relationship between church and state should be. And in some ways that seems kind of strange, because this is, you can see how the question is related, but it seems like a distinct question. What really implicates the whole church-state question is one particular attempt to establish a foundation for the right to religious liberty. For example, one early this would be kind of the very difficult question of what should be the foundation or basis for the right to religious liberty. And let's say there's four possibilities. One, of course, is what the Enlightenment did. You could base the right to religious liberty on skepticism and rationalism, that there is no truth, and if there is truth, it's impossible to find or to get people to agree about. Pretty depressing, pessimistic basis, and not true. Just not true. The person is oriented to the truth, and religious truth, philosophical truth is real knowledge. It's really the subject of knowledge. I think rationalism is going to say theology is doesn't even really pertain to real knowledge. That's more opinion than knowledge, but that's an incorrect view. Thomas talks about this. Thomas talks about, well, how you have a discussion with, say, Muslims. It's like, well, the scriptures that the ideas that you might share in common, you discuss those, or if there aren't any, you discuss the natural law. Or he says, if you're discussing with Jews, well, you can talk about the Old Testament. And you see, Thomas has this very hopeful view. Well, I'm a reasonable person, or I'm trying to be, and I'm talking to a reasonable person who doesn't share the faith, and he may be won over by the grace of God in cooperation with his own search for truth, in cooperation with our friendship too, the benefits of our friendship and our treating each other in a truly human way. So this Enlightenment idea, very much not Thomas's idea, and really one the church could never. Why, some people ask, why did it take the church so long to embrace the idea of religious liberty? This is why, because the Enlightenment basis for it was not a good foundation.
Yeah.
May have been a correct result, but you didn't show your work, as our math teachers used to tell us, or you showed it and it was a problem. The next possible idea that people thought of as a basis for the right to religious liberty was the idea of conscience. And that sounds really promising to start with. You think, well, wow, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, those sound like kind of natural mates there. And it's true in a sense. If what you believe is true, you do have a right to believe it and to practice it, if what you believe is true. However, what if you are not following your conscience, and you're not doing it? You just are not going to do it. Maybe I'll do it in 5 years, but I'm just not going to do it now. How can a right be based on my conscience if I knowingly am disregarding my conscience? And there's even a problem if I'm trying to follow my conscience, but I really go wrong and get a very bad decision, and embrace something that's not the truth, but that's a socially destructive idea. So I've been sincere, but what I ended up embracing was a religion that includes human sacrifice. If the right's based on conscience, then it's hard to exclude me, because we're saying that well, he's exercising his right. Boy, that's kind of unfortunate. the world's my hostage, right? I mean, if
Yeah.
anything we do in the name of religion is legitimate,
Yeah.
then the world's hostage to all of us at our worst moments, in a sense. So as
Yeah.
promising as conscience seems, it really cannot be the basis for the universal right to religion. And again, Murray was very helpful here. Murray really saw this, and he wasn't the only one, but he was one of the most important ones that really pointed out the difficulty, as kind of alluring as it would seem to be, to base the right on conscience. But then we get into this idea of church and state with sort of our third candidate. That's what our third possible candidate, still staying with John Courtney Murray. We've gotten, and why we might be discussing the whole church state arrangement in this debate on religious liberty. And it's because the next candidate for the foundation of the right to religious liberty was this idea of the incompetence of the state in religious matters. And this was many esteemed people have put forward this basis for religious liberty. Just to name two of them, Murray, probably the person more than anyone else identified with the document, but someone more recently, Thomas Pink,
Yeah.
talks about the incompetence of the state as the basis, and this solution, both as described by Murray and Pink, it really is seemingly very elegant, very kind of streamlined, sophisticated, but not too complicated. And where this comes in Murray's thought is that modern political theory has established the state as incompetent in spiritual, religious, and even aesthetic matters. That this is just, we just don't recognize that the state has competence in this area. Now, when we say incompetent, we don't mean incompetent in the Barney Fife sense. That,
Right.
he does everything wrong. He shoots himself.
I
in
don't
the
know.
foot.
I kind of feel like when I go to some of the museums, I feel like there might be some incompetence here, but maybe that's not a reflection of the state. That's just people.
That could be. But we're in Murray's thought, it would be incompetent more in the sense of lacking jurisdiction or lacking suitability to judge, that this is not its area of expertise, and we have not, as a people, empowered our government to make these decisions. So if the government is incompetent, the state's incompetent, then you're left with this zone of religion that kind of by default the state can't enter. And so the right to religious liberty comes from this inability of the state to enter this zone. Very alluring idea, and potentially seems like it could solve a lot of problems. Unfortunately, there are a number of very serious difficulties with the idea of basing religious liberty on the state's incompetence. The first one is that this is just not what the council did. I mean, if you read the document, it does not. Some of the drafts that were under Murray's control really emphasized this argument, but they were after kind of Murray's time and kind of being the main drafter. After that passed, this argument was reduced more and more until there's barely an echo of it in the final document. And the final document simply does not base the right on the incompetence of the state. We'll see our final candidate is human dignity, and the document says outright we're basing the right to religious liberty, or more directly, the right is founded on the dignity of the human person. So one thing is, it just is not to say that the incompetence of the state is the basis. That's just not what the council did, and it does not have support in the text. The second thing is that the second problem with this alluring idea is that the only type of discrimination or persecution that it would prevent would be state persecution, because the whole idea is that the state's disabled from going into the religious sphere. So the only thing it really addresses is state persecution. But Vatican II really was after bigger game than that. It wanted a broader right, and in again Article 2, it says that this is a right to be free from coercion by individuals, by social groups, or any human power. It's not just the state, but it's even other individuals, even other groups, and really any human power. So this basing religious liberty on state incompetence, it still leaves you subject to a lot of religious persecution. And then I think third, the idea, I've kind of touched on this already, I think this is just an unrealistic idea, the state incompetence idea, because in practice it's actually hard to say when the state can act in a way that affects religion and when it can't. Murray never, really surprisingly for all he wrote, never or almost never deals with this. He never says, well, what can't the state do? He kind of assumes that it's just every question falls on one side or the other. Either it's a religious question or it's a state question. What about education? Whose interest is that? Is that the state's interest or is that the church's interest? It's both. What about marriage? Is that the state's interest or is that a religious interest? It's both. What about human rights? Is that the state's interest or is that a religious interest? It's both. What about taxes? Well, mostly a state thing, but when we're talking about do we tax religious organizations, religions, I've said before, you've got to decide what to do. You can't just be completely neutral. So I think this as a lot of people still have a great deal of faith in this argument, but I do not believe it's tenable at all. And so our last candidate, as we said, is human dignity. And it's clear that's what Vatican II actually chose. Article 2, religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person. This is a hard document to interpret, and I think lesson 1 is staying close to the text. The other benefit of human dignity has some difficulties too. It's a very broad subject, and human dignity has a lot of different aspects. So some criticize it as a basis by saying, well, what aspect of human dignity? That's you're not being specific enough. And I think that can be a real danger, but I think the council does a pretty good job of addressing that, or at least making it pretty clear. The other difficulty, or really the benefit of basing the right on human dignity, is that this makes it a proper basis for a truly natural right, a right that truly belongs to the human person, that's due to the human person as such. The problem with Murray's theory about state incompetence is he based it on political theory, right? So, and that was a development in political theory that came along at a certain point and became ascendant and is still ascendant probably, but it's not permanent. It's not necessarily a permanent achievement. So for one thing, that gives us a historical dilemma. Were all previous church-state relationships improper? I think Murray might say yes. I think he might say, well, virtually all of them. There's problems, and I think that's something we usually don't want to say in the church, that, oh yeah, we made this 1,500-year mistake, not just us as governors of the church, the hierarchy. It's a mistake of the whole society. It's the whole society being wrong in a very important issue for 1,500, 1,700 years or something. And I think that's something that the church would be reluctant to say. Certainly, this came up not often, but it did come up in the council debates, and you had it mentioned in the sense of, we need to be careful here. This might take much more study to really do some kind of exhaustive look back and say, the church had no problem saying, hey, there have been some ups and downs, and sometimes the message has been spread in a way that really was not so much in accordance with the gospel. So it's not just a PR move, but we're accusing people. If we're looking back and saying all these regimes have been in error, then we're accusing a lot of people perhaps not having done what they should have. But also, if we're basing the right on state incompetence, because that's a idea from political theory that comes along at a certain time, it raises the question, is religious liberty only a right for our time? And you see this idea in some of Professor Pink's writings, saying, well, we don't expect this to change, but this is sort of a position that the church has right now. And Murray will call it a natural right, but he'll call it something like a natural right in our time, or a natural right in this era that we're at. Well, if that's what it is, not sure that is a natural right, at least as
Right.
understood by the tradition more broadly. So why is this something? Why is religious liberty owed to the human person? Because he's a seeker of truth, because he's inherently religious. The human person is inherently a religious being. It's also inherently a social being, and the proper way for this truth seeker to seek truth is freely and without coercion. That's the way. That's why he has the power of speech to discuss these ideas, to receive the ideas. Go back to Thomas's idea. Yeah, talk to your Muslim friend. Maybe you'll make some progress. Maybe you'll do this enormous hopefulness about the ability of people to both disseminate the truth, but also to receive the truth. I think that's the council's not talking directly about Thomas, but I think it's very much on his page.
So because of the social dynamic and free will, did I understand that correctly?
Free will, the social nature of the person, the
Mhm.
religious nature of the person, and I think the person's kind of natural orientation to seeking the truth. I think we could also say the person's obligation to seek the truth. The
Okay.
person's
Yeah.
now we're
Yeah.
not going to. If somebody says, "Well, I know I should be doing this, but I'm not going to do it," we don't want to empower the state or any individual or anybody to force the person, but it
Sure.
is something. If someone asks, this is an obligation that you have as a human person.
Here's a follow-up question here from Dr. DeClue on this point before we move forward and kind of wrap it up here. Does an incompetence of the state have support insofar as it cites Leo the 13th, at least in the Relationis, and that was Leo the 13th's position?
That's a position that that Dr. Pink puts forward, and that relatio that Pink relies on this point. It is one. Now, that was a relatio on. It was one of the drafts that Murray was in charge of. So it's one of these drafts that recognized a very sharp distinction between church and state. What like Murray talks about the temporal order is like confined entirely to the temporal order. That's Murrayite language, and that was kind of the language of that relatio. The final document does not speak that way. The only thing it says the state is incompetent to do is to force a religious decision on you or to inhibit you in your religious activity without a sufficient reason. So what Dr. Pink is basing his position on is this relatio on, again, I think it's the fourth draft. It's either the third or fourth draft. And that was a very Murrayite draft, but that language that is being interpreted there through Leo, that is language that did not survive into the final document. So I don't think that, and this is dealt with in the book, but I don't think that that part of the relatio retains a great deal of force because it's commentary on on the part of the draft that did not survive at all. I should say did not survive at all. It does have this faint remnant and at the end of Article 3 that says the state is incompetent, or that's not, it doesn't even say the state's incompetent there, but it says the state exceeds its authority if it presumes to command or inhibit religious acts. I don't think the document even uses the word incompetence or competence ever. I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm sure it does not use the word incompetence of the state.
I have a quick question about this. So, okay, the relatio that you're referencing is in reference to a draft that wasn't really adopted, or at least that relevant portion wasn't adopted, and therefore that interpretive authority that the relatio has is moot because that is for a previous draft.
At least that part of the relatio.
Okay. So now, but is this the same relatio that the November 19th, 1963 relatio is that the one we're referencing, or is there a
No,
different
this was
one?
a later one. This was I want to say probably May 1960. I'm thinking it was May 1965, which I
Okay.
think is the Textus Re-emendatus, which I call the fourth draft. You'll see people number the drafts differently.
Uh-huh.
So there's a relatio. Really, for each draft, there's a relatio. Well, there's
Hmm.
usually both an oral relatio and a
Hmm.
written relatio, and
Hmm.
so together there's going to be quite a few of them.
Okay.
Yeah, it's and I should have looked this up beforehand, but I think that's the May 1965 relatio, but I
Fair
could be
enough.
mistaken.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I was distinguishing it from a different one. That's helpful.
Yeah, so the November, so the one you mentioned, that would be an early one. And again, I think
Right.
it's going to depend on what survives. So
Right.
I'm somewhat critical of Professor Pink's use of this relatio, though I do use the relatio myself, but I use it in interpreting a point that that was maintained
There
into the
was
final
adopted.
document.
Makes sense. Yeah, I could see it having interpretive authority there. Yeah, that's helpful. Very helpful. So okay, let me ask you this. How do you think that Vatican II's teaching on religious liberty has really been received in the post-conciliar church, or do you think that on the whole it's been largely misunderstood and we're still waiting on a reception?
That's such an interesting question. That is just it's kind of a fun question too, maybe. Well, okay, this is why I'm saying that. I can't help thinking of a friend of mine who doesn't mind being criticized as long as he's not ignored. And then so
Uh-huh.
I'm kind of wonder if we could personify Dignitatis Humanae, if Dignitatis Humanae would feel that way, that, well, at least they're still talking about me in
Yeah.
some sense. Certainly by that metric, Dignitatis Humanae is done, if you count the ink spilled, uh, I don't know if it would be in first place, but I'm confident it would be in first place with any document that's not an actual constitution. But I think in other ways too, on the merits, Dignitatis Humanae has had a kind of a good run. I mean, I think just this interest in it shows that this is still a very vibrant topic. People are quite interested in it. The popes continue to return to it and use it. All of the popes after Vatican II, other than John Paul I, was a special case there. But
Mhm.
and they've really made Dignitatis Humanae the real basis of their diplomatic activity. And there's been a lot of scholarship about it. Now, again, in the years after the council, up until well, let's say a ways out from the council. So after the
Mhm.
council, you've got people talking about it a lot in the first couple of years at least. But for a while, we don't get this kind of blossoming of scholarship on Dignitatis Humanae that we've seen a fair amount of. Um, and I think that's largely because the acta of the council don't appear until, and once, I don't know if it hadn't been for Harrison, if anybody would if everybody would have gone to the octa, but once Harrison does it, then everybody after Harrison needs to take account of the octa. So in some ways, a very very good run, but definitely the subject of a lot of criticism, and not necessarily frivolous criticism either. I mean, really, uh, I mean, some of the criticism of it is shallow, but there's some very substantive criticism and some very serious points made by the critics of the document that really should not be dismissed. And this is something relevant to moral theology too. I mean, if this is something, this is Father Curran based his dissent largely on Dignitatis Humanae, saying the church changed that, the church can change contraception. Church changed that, the church can change artificial insemination. The church, I mean, honestly, he had this whole, it was about 7 or 8 things that he dissented on, and his reason was, he cited other documents too, but the one that was always cited, that he always cited, was Dignitatis Humanae. Yeah, I think, has it been well received yet? I guess I'd have to say the reception's by no means complete, but I think, scholars like Valloway, Harrison, Barrett Turner, Russell Hittinger really done a great job in helping with that. Again, I'm not there've been good scholars on the other side too. They're mostly French. I'm trying to remember. I wish I could remember their names at the moment, but they're cited very, very often. But I think that does remain to be completed. And I think that Dignitatis Humanae not only is non-contradictory, but I think it actually infuses the 19th century teaching with renewed relevance, and it conserves and it really, in a way, revivifies those teachings and extends them, especially with this concern, not only with the individual, but with society. So it's really, you've got this immense concern, and you really see this clear as a bell in Leo XIII, concern for human integrity. If we don't have a good understanding of these things, we could be fracturing the human person. And I think we see that. And you had a bishop, I think he was the Bishop of Prague, his name was Josef Beran, give a very moving speech at Vatican II about this, about how religious persecution could split the person, in a sense, in two, and really almost shatter the wholeness of the person. Why? Because we might be saying, well, you can worship at home, you can say your prayers, nobody's going to stop you from saying your prayers, but you have to deny what your religious identity is when you come out into the public square. We're essentially asking someone to deny the most important thing about them in a way. And I think that's one of the errors that Vatican II is correcting. And when I say they're extending the teachings of the 19th century popes, the 19th century popes had that exact same concern, though it was for the Catholic flock. What Vatican II is doing is extending that concern for human integrity beyond the Catholic flock and to people as a whole. I think one of the things, I hope eventually some of the traditionalist faithful will become more interested in this document, because some of the work that the kind of traditionalist bishops, or I guess they weren't really called traditionalists at the time, more conservative bishops, did at the council, they really improved the document. Both those who were critics, who really did not want a religious liberty document, but then other critics like John Paul II, then Archbishop of Krakow, who wanted a document but had problems with, say, Murray's kind of legal approach and wanted something more theological. So you had different kinds of criticisms. But I think because the traditionalist camp really never wanted this document in the first place, I think ironically they might be failing to appreciate the contributions that sort of their own paisans made at the council by improving the document, because they may not be sufficiently grateful because they didn't want this document to pass in the first place. Well, understood, but what did pass may have been improved by both the people who were most critical, who didn't want a document at all, but also those who were critical, but who did want to come to an eventual document, like John Paul II.
Let me go back to something you said there about Curran that struck me. It seems that there might be a false analogy that he may have made there, if I understood correctly, between his acts of dissent, um, or at least his attributing of error on part of the magisterium to what was potentially taking place at Vatican II. Let's just say for a moment that somehow Vatican II taught an error. I think that it would be pretty clear that this was non-definitive in nature, whereas it seems like some of the things that Curran would have denied would have been definitive teachings. And so I don't know if any kind of dissent against Vatican II on religious liberty would justify his dissent against definitive teachings.
Really good point. Now Curran claimed that he did not dissent from any infallible
Right, of
teaching.
course he would. Sure, sure, sure.
So, but I have to say, to his credit, I'm glad he did this. Curran published his letters. He'd write these very long, elaborate letters to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and then the congregation would write back usually pretty short letters. But he published them all in a. I think the book is called Faithful Dissent.
Yeah, I have it. Yeah.
It's but I don't have it. But I'm glad he published that because
Yeah.
you really get to see what happened. But Cardinal Ratzinger responded, well, you say this, but one of the things you dissent on is the indissolubility of marriage. And that is something
That's
that,
definitive. Yeah.
yeah. So I think you're quite right. And I also think that goes back potentially, at least, as an additional caution to our discussion about levels of teaching, that you can kind of get into, not that it's I think it's entirely a legitimate avenue of analysis, but you can get into the area of where you're dissenting from more and more things, but also where you are you're neglecting that this is that what you are dissenting from is of a higher level than what you're claiming.
Yeah, that's what I notice a lot of, unfortunately, and not to mention this issue of public dissent. I don't know if I'm even buying any license for that in light of Dona Veritatis, among other things. And I saw, some of what Karen tried to use to justify public dissent, and I guess I'm just not buying it. But yeah, again, especially in light of Dona Veritatis, which is authoritative on the matter. So I think there's that issue too. But yeah, this has been incredibly fascinating. I mean, let me briefly just kind of ask you here about the question of Exsurge Domine before we wrap it up. Can you maybe briefly talk about it and how it's maybe relevant to the discussion of the death penalty, and maybe weigh in on how authoritative is that proposition that is being condemned in Exsurge Domine?
Sure. This most of the discussion with the Vatican II documents, or with the Vatican II religious liberty teaching, most of it goes back to the 19th century popes, because they wrote quite a bit on this area, and again of some documents of quite a high level of authority. But one that goes back a ways further is this papal bull by Leo X in 1520 that condemns 41 of Luther's propositions. And one of those is, quote, that heretics be burned is against the will of the Spirit, end quote. And so Leo condemns this proposition. So this, you can imagine well, I don't actually have to ask you to imagine it, because you're dealing with it quite a bit, Michael, that there's a lot of criticism of both by non-Catholics, but fellow Catholics as well, that the church may seem here to be saying that believing in the burning of heretics is something like an article of faith. Really not nearly as big of a problem as that, because again, there's 41 propositions, and they were all rejected, but rejected in a blanket way. So they were rejected with several different degrees of censure. The highest is heresy, but there were several different degrees. Some were much less serious than heresy, such as offensive to pious ears, or something that's just imprudent. Here's the actual statement. All of these 41 propositions are rejected, quote, as either heretical, scandalous, false, offensive to pious ears, or seductive of simple minds, and against Catholic truth, end quote. So what he's saying now, the cardinals were helping the Pope at this time. And so one of them, Cajetan, actually wanted the Pope to specify a specific censure for each of the propositions, so people would know this one's heretical, this one's imprudent but not heretical, maybe this one's close to heresy or something. There you could use other censures as well. The Pope, however, did not want to do that, and the reason for it seems to be that he considered Luther's ideas a real threat and thought it would just take a lot longer, which it no doubt would have, to study each of the 41 propositions and to apply a specific censure to each one. And so instead, he lists the ones that concerns him, the 41 propositions, and then he says all of them are problematic for one of these reasons. Some of them might be heretical, some of them might be essentially things that are confusing or imprudent to say. So that's really as far as we can get with the with what he said about heretics being burned, that there was some reason, at least, that he thought this was imprudent, but we can't conclude that he was condemning it as heretical. Some of the scholars on religious liberty, like Harrison and Valloway, have proposed some ideas that for why Leo X might have considered this kind of an imprudent thing to say. Harrison says that people were accustomed to the burning of heretics in the 16th century. Now that seems weird, but you find historically less protest against it than you think you would find. This sounds so strange to us because we certainly would protest a lot. But Harrison says perhaps Leo's concern was that if Luther's proposition were adopted, people would think heresy was not a serious matter. Another possibility that Valloway mentions is that this bull does not necessarily even concern the church's power, the church's course of power. It may be talking about the state's power when heretics threaten civil society. So it might really be talking about making a judgment in the other realm. And then finally, there's another scholar earlier from about 100 years ago named Vermeersch. And he says that this proposition and its rejection by Leo X, that all it stands for is the idea that in certain circumstances, it's legitimate to execute heretics. That's kind of Vermeersch's idea, or Vermeersch's kind of interpretation, or his kind of guess at what this might mean. So this is something not all of the writers on religious liberty mention, but at least Harrison and Valloway do, and so they suggest some of these possible understandings. But we don't have this straight conflict here, because you really, from what we have, you really can't conclude that Leo was understanding this point as an article of the faith.
I was very happy to see you conclude that, because it's helped confirm just my own personal evaluation of the matter, because I came to the same conclusion about this. Since it's a global censor and he doesn't identify the proposition of heresy specifically for this, it's likely that it's a minor censor or something like that. And so, yeah, that was incredibly helpful. And now I have a professor to back up that interpretation, so I'll always reference you from now on.
I'm happy to help.
So yeah, once again, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. I'd love to get you on again in the future. Thank you so much for your time. I recommend everybody go and get a copy of the book. It is right there in the show notes with the St. Paul Center, Emmaus Academic Religious Liberty, and the Hermeneutic of Continuity, Conservation, and Development of Doctrine at Vatican II by Professor Michael Dunnigan. Once again, Professor, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. Do you want to put in a plug for anything else?
No, just want to thank you for having me back. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Enjoy your work so much, as my students do as well. And so just please keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'll get you back on in the future, Lord willing. Hey, everybody, hit the like button and the subscribe button. Also, check me out, patreon.com/reason and theology if you want to support me. We'll see you later. God bless.
Take care.